SIXNewsAU is focusing on, unsurprisingly, on the Ben Roberts-Smith verdict now that the full, or at least the open court judgment has been handed. And of course, there are some parts we don't know because part of the case is what's heard behind closed doors in the court. So we don't know everything, but the judgment has been released. A 726-page judgment, 2,618 paragraphs, I believe. So a pretty hefty one. So Dr. Joseph is joining us today to help break down exactly what this judgment is all about. A lot of the media coverage that we've seen has been talking about Justice Pisanko, the federal court judge who heard this case, finding that Robert Smith committed war crimes. Yeah, this was a case originally brought by Robert Smith about defamation. How did those media outlets manage to successfully turn the tables on Robert Smith and make the case about war crimes rather than about defamation, which is what it was originally about?
Thank you for the question. I think a good place to start would be to acknowledge how this case actually came about. And the initiator of this case was not the media, but Ben Roberts-Smith himself, as a result of the legal action that he launched. This court decision would not have come about if Ben Roberts-Smith had not sued. And once the suit was launched, it fell upon the defendants to respond. One of the responses could have been to simply pack up their bags and apologize, retract, correct, whatever, and settle. And it would have ended there, no judgment. And it does happen that this is how some defamation cases end up. There's a settlement, there's no trial. But in this case, the respondents, when it fell to them to respond, they decided to fight. In other words, to defend their publications. And in so doing, they had to decide what kind of defense they would rely on, because defamation law has many defenses, makes many defenses available to defendants. And here, I must say I was quite impressed that the media chose to use the truth defense. It's not often that the media tries this defense because it is notoriously difficult to argue the truth defense. And the media's success in defending this action boils down to the rigorous work that the journalists concerned had done, the contributions that were made by confidential and other sources, the resolute response from all of these people, plus the owners of the publication, to stand behind their journalism, stand behind the journalists. And I must also acknowledge the court's preparedness to pay adequate heed to the media defendants' arguments. And I'll say more about this further down.
Substantial truth seems pretty straightforward, but what about the second defense that was used, contextual truth? So from my reading of the Defamation Act, that seems to be a much more complicated defense rather than just substantially true.
Okay. Between the two defenses, both have challenges. Both can be difficult. And I would suggest that the truth defense is not as straightforward as it appears, because it can be very difficult to prove that an imputation is true. Remember, the whole point, the whole manner in which defamation law works is what the defendant is required to defend is not the literal meaning of the words that were published, but the imputations that were conveyed. So when we as media people, as journalists, write things, we need to think ahead to what sorts of imputations may be conveyed in addition to the literal meanings that are conveyed. And you can only introduce evidence in court that is admissible. So there's a break there. You cannot say so and so told me that this happened, so it must be true. We need to be able to produce evidence of the fact that we have published and the imputation that springs from it. You need original documents and witnesses to come forward, and that is something that's very challenging. More so, I'd suggest, in a trial of this nature that involves questions of national security, questions of strict discipline within the army, questions of the code of silence. There is something that, the SAS and people in the army are obligated to observe. It's the code of silence. In other words, don't speak, don't snitch, don't leak. And it's against these odds that, the media is trying to argue the truth defense. So it's quite a difficult defense to argue in this particular case, especially.
This, of course, was tried without a jury, and I think everyone's grateful that the New South Wales Act has provisions about very long and complicated trials, not least people who would have sat on a jury. But I'm curious about these defenses. Do you think that having them being made out for a judge rather than a jury, as might happen in simpler defamation cases, helped one party or another, or did it make any difference at all?
One of my great reservations about jury trials is you never get to know how they arrived at their conclusions. And especially in a case like this, I would be very curious how, information was digested, how it was analyzed, and what kind of reasoning accompanies the decision that is reached. You don't have the luxury of that with a jury trial. And the other thing that troubles me about jury trials is, especially in high-profile cases, the information landscape can become highly contaminated. It's very hard to tell how much of the influence that was brought to bear on the jury came from what was actually tendered in court as admissible material, as opposed to what may have been consumed in addition to what was tendered in court. So I have no serious problems about this not being a jury trial. And because there is a judgment, and an extremely long one at that, Justice Bizenko is now there for all the world to judge himself, to be judged. And it opens up a very clear pathway for the dissatisfied side to decide whether there is enough grounds to mount an appeal.
For those of us reading the judgment, it felt like too thorough on occasion, but we were glad he was able to do that.
Every minute detail,
Yes.
Attention, yes.
So now, when it comes to these allegations of war crimes, there's been some confusion, I think some trepidation about whether or not someone can now say if Ben Roberts-Smith is a war criminal without putting themselves at risk of future action. This has been a debate, I think, in every media outlet. It's been debated at SIX, I know. What is the difference between simply putting as a headline, Ben Roberts-Smith is a war criminal, and a preponderance of the evidence suggests that Ben Roberts-Smith may have committed war crimes?
Yeah. To put it in a nutshell, there is a difference, although to some it might be a case of splitting of hairs. To say that Ben Roberts-Smith has committed war crimes is to suggest that he was found criminally liable for war crimes as a result of a criminal prosecution that involved war crimes. There has been no criminal prosecution as yet. So technically already you got to take a step back. And until that happens, until such a war crimes prosecution and trial happens, and a determination is made specifically on the commission of war crimes, as opposed to a decision being made on damage to reputation as a result of publication, using defamation law, where all that needed to be proven to succeed with the defense was substantial truth, using civil standard of proof, which is the balance of probabilities, which, if I can describe in a picturesque way, is anything above 50% is, sufficient for a civil standard of proof, balance of probabilities. Whereas if you say it is a criminal standard, it's fair to say, again, picturesquely put, 90% level of standard needs to be met. So this is not the standard that applied here. It was not a criminal prosecution standard, but civil standard. So it would be fairer to say there is enough basis in this judgment to investigate further whether he is guilty of committing war crimes based on the defamation case. This is not to suggest that Justice Zanko just willy-nilly, chucked in a few of his whimsical ideas and decided, this stinks. I think he's guilty. And as we have just discussed, he in fact forensically digested all the evidence that was put there, in spite of the fact that the civil standard applied. In a loose sense that it is possible to say, this stinks to high heaven, and there's a pretty good chance that Ben Roberts-Smith did commit war crimes. But technically speaking, until such time that that threshold is applied and met in a decision handed down, specifically in relation to a war crimes trial, it's better to avoid those lavish, exuberant headings that call him a war criminal. Ben Roberts-Smith, suggested in court, and you can see this in paragraph 120, that the journalists are not war crimes investigators. Their allegations should be treated with caution. And who could disagree with that? Journalists cannot compel witnesses to testify under oath. So they were going on a wing and a prayer in trying to get information to write their stories. But, this is not to say that the journalists were incompetent or not accomplished. They're both of very, very, very high stature in the journalism landscape. I would say not just in Australia, but internationally. Nick McKenzie, 14 Walkley Awards. That's a record that's hard to beat. Chris Masters, his work saw the fall of one government in Australia. So these are people who, when they say something, you can bet your bottom dollar they have thought long and hard about it. And the evidence that the judge had before him led him to say that despite using the civil standard of proof, there was clear and cogent proof. So as to whether Ben Roberts-Smith is a war criminal, it's interesting. You look at paragraph 113, where he said, the making of findings adverse to him in this trial will result in it being more likely that he will be charged with war crimes. So you can see, my hair splitting here shows the difference between what we can draw from this case and what we might draw from any potential war crimes case.
Let's say Ben Roberts-Smith gets upset at media coverage after this judgment. Does he have a reputation left to defend at this point?
I think this pertains. This draws out something you've asked further down about different sectors of reputation. I I mean, speaking as a citizen, as a consumer of news, and someone who is got a slight advantage in understanding this area of the law, I'd say that it's quite fallacious, to suggest that you can isolate parts of your reputation and say, I have an excellent reputation, but only for this. I might say I'm an excellent chef in the kitchen, but if you give me a recognition for me being an excellent chef, I should be entitled to protect that reputation. I should be able to sue and please ignore the fact that I've cheated people of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think it's a pretty weird kind of exercise to have, to be forced to take into account. And in this case, I think it's even more ridiculous to suggest that Ben Roberts-Smith's reputation has got enough in there to isolate, different parts of his reputation as being worth protecting.
One question that we have about Robert Smith is that even the Justice Pasenko said that he was very nice, he was polite. People are always, talking about him being nice and polite and a kind person before the allegations were made against him. But at the same time, they found that he had lied and that he was abusing. There's even potentially going to be a criminal case over how he treated one of the potential witnesses to bully them and send threats to stop them from coming to trial. Would that sort of stuff, his lies and his cover-ups, he lied about burying evidence at one point. Would that affect the judgment at all if he's got a bad character? I know the judge did briefly talk about character in the judgment, but are these sorts of things about lies and honesty relevant? Because it's not a criminal case. Of course, if everyone who's seen a cop show knows the culprit lies, but that's a criminal case. Are lies and character relevant at all in a civil case about defamation? Are they at all relevant?
Oh yes, I mean, it goes to the heart of whether the judge should believe the testimony that's being put forward. When witnesses are not reliable, are not trustworthy, and they lie and they contradict themselves, and they have convenient memory lapses when pointed questions are put to them. All of this goes to indicate to the court how much weight they should attach to the testimony being given. And even though that this was a civil trial, we need to be conscious of the fact that the court was very mindful that he should be careful about making adverse findings given the gravity of the allegations. These were serious allegations, and the court needed to apply a proportionately stricter standard in testing the evidence that was given to it to enable it to make its decision. And so being polite is one thing. I think that can be separated from whether a person is telling the truth or not. And in this case, it's clear the court felt that Ben Roberts-Smith did lie. Not only did he lie, but he had potentially used unlawful means to threaten other witnesses against coming forward with their testimony. So that doesn't reflect very well at all on Robert Smith.
The basis on which Robert Smith would claim good character would, of course, be that he's a highly decorated soldier, and then the trial is actually to find out if that basis for his good character that ordinarily would be the highest character is in fact entirely false.
Yeah. So, as many commentators have said before, it has spectacularly backfired. And we continue to ask ourselves, why is it that he gambled such a gamble? Why was he so confident that he could pull it off? and I'm lost other than to infer that he thought there would be a shortage of witnesses who would be brave enough to come forward. He probably thought that given the strong financial backing that he had, lawyers and witnesses on his side, that he could pull it off. But at the end of the day, his fire was met with fire. And thank goodness for that. I'm not confident that many media organizations or many journalists would have the same degree of caliber, strength, fortitude, resoluteness, and thoroughness and skill in telling such stories in our media. But if I can jump to that last question you had about what does this mean for press freedom, it has been an expensive way to get such a fundamental liberty, a fundamental human right safeguarded. It's ridiculous, and I don't think the journalists at the center of it over celebrating the victory. It has been an ordeal for both of them. They are exhausted. They've given up many years of their life trying to stand by their work. Credit to their employers. And as I said earlier, credit to all the sources who stood by the initial contribution of information by actually then agreeing to come forward and testify in court, where you can get yourself dragged through the coals and put through more trauma and all of this. And I don't want to overlook the role of the court as well. The courts have traditionally not been terribly media friendly in Australia. And this is not a case of where the court was media friendly, but it was prepared to give credit where it was due, in my view. And hooray for that.
And before we wrap up on that theme of press freedom, the big cloud hanging over this trial is, of course, national security issues, and especially national security issues when everyone's watching the trial, everyone's talking about it online. There were concerns even at the end that the Commonwealth might delay publication of the judgment. And in light of all that, how should the government make that balance? How should the courts make the balance between national security and open justice? And then in this case, how well do you think that balance was struck?
I tend to lean towards giving the courts a greater say over the merits of classifying something as taboo or of national security, to the extent that the courts should be closed or material should be redacted because it contains things with national security implications. There are far too many examples of national security serving as a camouflage for improper things to be done that the public are not able to watch, to check, to hold politicians to account. Classic case was the Bernard Colliery case, the bugging of the East Timor cabinet. What national security issue possibly, is there that prevents the public from knowing what goes on in a trial involving the person who was involved in whistleblowing or defending the whistleblower in that case?
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode, talking about the Ben Roberts-Smith verdict. And thank you everyone else for joining us and watching. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Elijah.